I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. I'm still recovering from a bit of a flu. I thought I was over it, and then it came back with a vengeance. I have a little bit of a cough, but I do have a new episode for you today that was recorded early last week with historian and scholar of the modern Middle East, Professor James Gelvin. And we'll be taking a look at the state of the Middle East, the Arab world, in 2026. And a good portion of this conversation will look back on Professor James Gelvin's 2017 book, The New Middle East, What Everyone Needs to Know. What has changed since that book came out in 2017? What should those of us interested in the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East be focused on right now? We'll talk about all of that. We'll discuss Syria, Iran, and much, much more in this conversation. But before we get to that, I want to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. So please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And also, if you can, please head on over to the website of my one and only sponsor, the man that helps make this show possible, along with you, the listener, who supports me on Patreon. I'm talking about Mike Swanson and his website, wallstreetwindow.com. Great financial and trading newsletter. Sign up for it. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. And if you sign up, you can get a free copy of Mike's ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I've ever used. Check it out at wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Professor James Gelvin. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very, very pleased to have on. Professor James Gelvin is a distinguished historian of the modern Middle East and author of several influential books, including The New Middle East and the Israel-Palestine conflict, 100 Years of War. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. Well, considering the circumstances. I guess everybody says that these days.
Ain't that the truth? I wanted to have you back on because I know a lot of my listeners are familiar with your work on Israel-Palestine, but you also have done broader work on the Middle East and the more specifically the modern Middle East and what has shaped it. Maybe we could start with how you see Israel-Palestine as fitting into maybe a bigger picture of the region.
That's a good question because it tends to get exaggerated, its importance for the overall region. I mean, we tend to be very much Israel-focused, Israel-Palestine focused, and particularly after October 7th of 2023, this is something that we're just very used to. But there's a lot of other issues that go on in this area. I mean, this is a very important area for the United States. Any power that wants to consider itself a global power, for example, has to take knowledge of the Middle East. It is, after all, the Middle East, and so therefore we have interest in both Europe and in East Asia. And then, on top of that, it has been a tumultuous region, particularly in the 21st century. And the United States began withdrawing from the region in the 21st century, and that's made the situation even worse. So overall, it's not a very pleasant situation that's going on now in the Middle East. On top of that, human security is very, very bad in the region. And when I talk about human security, what I mean is everything from the amount of water that's available in the region, to the amount of food that's available, to good governance, to education, to healthcare. All these things are not very high on the priorities of governments in the region at the present time.
Can you speak to, I want to talk a little bit about your book that came out, I believe, in 2018, The New Middle East, and what has changed since then. because it feels like we may be entering even a new transition period. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but can you talk a little bit about that book from 2018 and what has maybe changed since then?
Well, there's been a lot of things that have changed. As a matter of fact, the last lecture I gave in a survey course in the fall of this year was on what I didn't predict and what has differed in the region. I mean, for example, one of the things I wrote about is whatever happened to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Well, we found out with a vengeance what happened with an Israel-Palestine conflict. When the conflict tends to drop off the map, one of the actors in the conflict, usually the Palestinians, make it so that it has to become the focal point of world attention once again. And one of the reasons why Hamas did what they did on October 7th, 2023, was in order to make sure that the question of Palestine didn't drop off the map altogether. So there's that question as well. The Syrian conflict, for example, has been partially resolved. We don't know how much. We don't know whether it's closed the book on the conflict or whether it's just opened up a new chapter. But at the present time, the Syrian government is attempting to centralize power once again and is not having an easy time doing that. Israel has been able to destroy many of its enemies in the region, has been able to push back against Hezbollah, against Hamas, against the Iranians, for example. The Syrians have dropped off the map. The only real enemy Israel has right now are the Houthis in Yemen. But even that has made it so that Israel has sort of gone unilaterally. It's lost most of its support in Europe right now. It's lost a lot of support in the United States as well. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, has predicted that Israel will have to become completely independent, completely autarkic by within the next decade or so. In other words, no longer dependent on American weapons. On top of that, what I mentioned before, human security is abysmal in the area. And global warming is going to hit the area. Desertification is going to hit the area like in no other areas. There are multiple cities in the Middle East that are built on coastlines that will be susceptible to rising sea levels, for example. There's already, for example, water shortages in areas such as the Palestinian territories in Gaza and in Tehran is supposed to lose out on most of its water supplies. So, I mean, this is sort of the situation that we have now. There's also something that I didn't really foresee to the extent that it's taken place, which has been the free-for-all. With the withdrawal of the United States from the region, there has been no hegemonic power that's been able to prevent regional powers from attempting to assert their influence where they might. And those regional powers include, for example, the Saudis, include the United Arab Emirates, include Turkey. And so what we see is a lot of jockeying for a position that's taking place within the region at the present time, including areas that are new conflict zones in the region. Conflict zones such as, for example, the Nile River Valley, all the way back from Ethiopia, which has built a new dam, which the Egyptians have threatened to bomb. The Eastern Mediterranean with its newly discovered natural gas supplies, which have pitted Turkey and Libya against most of the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Tigris-Euphrates Valley, for example, which has also been a touchstone for conflict, and the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea area, in which there are right now 11 navies that are vying for some form of influence in the area, with the United Arab Emirates taking the lead in this. But it's not only the UAE, it's the United States, it's China, it's Egypt, it's Turkey, it's various other governments as well, the Saudis. So what we see is these spreading of conflict zones in the region. And as I said, that in part has to do with the lack of hegemon in the area. The United States is pretty much withdrawn from the area. And it also has to do with the fact that starting in about 2011 or so, states have been attacking each other or interfering in internal affairs of others with impunity. So, for example, we see multiple times in which, for example, proxy wars have been fought in Libya, for example, in Syria, in Yemen, and various other places as well. So what we see is a breakdown of the state system in the region as well.
In terms of the U.S. role uh, in the Middle East, I wanted to get your opinion on. I know Trump has only been in this second Trump presidency. We've only been in it for about a year now, but do you see any differences between his first presidency and the second presidency and how this administration is going to be involved with the Middle East?
Yes, it's more erratic now than it has been in the past. I mean, even more than it was in the past. In the past, it was fundamentally, you can count on Trump to just sort of like sort of be incoherent, but not in the sense of, having multiple incoherent policies at the same time. I mean, what is guiding Trump at the present time in the Middle East? Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, he wants to undo everything that Obama and Biden had done in the region, and that's just basically, his way. So Obama signed the non-proliferation agreement with Iran. He withdrew from that agreement. Obama had very bad relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel. Trump has tried to repair those relations, or actually has pretty much taken his marching orders from the Gulf states and from Israel as well. So what we see now is sort of like a weird situation in which the grift is very important. One of the reasons why Trump put pressure on Israel in terms of the ceasefire was that the Israelis had attacked Qatar to assassinate one of the leaders of Hamas. And you fundamentally don't attack a country in which your patron is building golf courses. So it's one of those things as well. Qatar also gave Trump the airplane that was supposed to be Air Force One. So there is this major grift that's taking place in terms of the Trump administration. Trump is fundamentally looking at Saudi Arabia, he's looking at Qatar, he's looking at the UAE, and seeing what their lead is and following their lead at the present time. And in terms of the Israel policy, there really is no Israel policy. We go back and forth on this thing. So at one time, we would put pressure on Israel for the ceasefire, but there's no further pressure to move to steps two of the ceasefire. So what we see is this absolutely incoherent policy that has to do with the total incompatibility of these various things that he wants to accomplish. What he wants to accomplish is he wants America first, but we've learned the new definition of America first over the last couple of weeks, which is not isolation of America, which is not withdrawal to our borders, but instead America will do what America wants to do whenever it wants to do it, wherever it wants to do it, without regard to any niceties of international law or what our allies wish it to do as well. So there's the grift as well. There's the idea that he has this admiration for strong men, including people like Erdogan in Turkey. He wants to undo what the Obama and Biden administrations have done. So all these things are taking place at the same time, and they make for a very incoherent policy. Now, one of the problems is that he loses his focus very, very quickly, very easily. And so one day he'll be focused on Gaza, the next day he'll be focused on, I don't know, Venezuela, let's say. Gaza just drops out totally from his focus. So we don't really know what he's attempting to do, and our allies don't really know what he's attempting to do. And this gets back to something that he once stated. He wanted to adopt what's called the Madman Doctrine. This was pioneered by Richard Nixon during the Vietnam War. The idea being that if you have an antagonist and that antagonist thinks you're crazy, then that antagonist is going to have to give in to your every whim. So during the negotiations over the Vietnam War, for example, we threatened to go escalate as far as nuclear weapons against Vietnam, North Vietnam, in order to get our way at the negotiating table. You can't negotiate with somebody who's crazy, so therefore Nixon expected the North Vietnamese to give in. Trump's policy is very, very similar. He wants to also be considered to be somebody who is erratic in the way that our enemies won't be able to maintain their balance. That's fine and good. The problem is that not only your enemies are not going to be able to maintain their balance, but your allies as well are not going to know what to expect, which means more isolation for the United States on the international realm.
What then, in terms of that, what do you think the biggest risks are in the Middle East right now? What I mean, because this has been a region, especially in places like Syria and Yemen, that have really been in hell at various points in uh, recent memory. Just a lot of suffering. What are the biggest risks this region of the world faces going forward?
I think the biggest risk is the fact that the United States is no longer an ally that can be considered to be rock solid. I mean, during the period between the 1970s and, let's say, the Obama administration, the United States was a hegemon. And fundamentally, we were on the same page as our allies were in the region. So, therefore, we were a status quo power during the Cold War. Our allies were status quo powers. They didn't want to see any upset of the state system. They didn't want to see any overthrow of governments. And so, therefore, we could actually count on them. We can count on Israel in the eastern part of the Mediterranean to keep a check on Syria. We could count on, before the revolution, Iran and Saudi Arabia to keep a check on Iraq. And so we were able to maintain stability in the region as a result of that. The problem is that since then, since the attempts by Obama to withdraw from the region, states have not been on the same page as the United States. They are no longer status quo states. They're jostling for advantage. And one of the problems may be that Trump will overplay his hand. In other words, he will allow a state like maybe Israel, like maybe one of our other allies in the Gulf, for example, to actually upset the apple cart in a way that is going to be difficult to maintain. So that's what the big problem is at the present time. I'm not going to say nuclear proliferation in terms of Iran. That is, temporarily at least, not on the table, although the overstatement as to what we accomplished in Iran is just that, an overstatement in terms of our ability to prevent the Iranians eventually from getting a nuclear weapon.
I'm curious, is it important to look back at the Obama era policy to understand the present? Are there reasons that the Obama policy fell through just beyond Trump, or should we be re-examining what happened in those years?
Yeah, I think there's good reason for it to fall through. I mean, Trump's policy is very, very different from Obama. Obama wanted to disengage from the Middle East. Trump wants to disengage from the Middle East and allow local people to run the show. But with Obama, it was different. During the most of the Cold War, the United States had a policy called offshore balancing in the region. The idea was that, as I said, since the United States and its allies were on the same page, since we were status quo powers, we didn't want to see the apple cart upset at all. So therefore, what the United States attempted to do was to work with its allies, and we would hold their coats while they got engaged in local disputes, regional disputes in the region. So we would guarantee that they would not be hurt in any substantial way, and they would fight America's battles for us because fundamentally they were fighting their own battles. So let me give you an example. In 1970, the Palestine Liberation Organization attempted to overthrow the government of Jordan. Now, the Israelis intervened to make sure that they didn't do so, and they sent their planes into the air to make sure the Syrians didn't intervene on the side of the Palestinians. Now, the reason why they were able to do that was that the United States sent its fleet, its Mediterranean fleet, to go into the Eastern Mediterranean to cover Israel, to make sure that the Israelis were covered in terms of air support by the Americans. So the Israelis actually were the ones who prevented the Syrians from intervening into the Jordanian war. And the Jordanians were able to defeat the PLO, and they were able to do that. The Israelis were able to do that because the Americans had their back. Now, this has been American policy. It's called offshore balancing. Now, what Obama attempted to do was to restore offshore balancing after the Bush administration decided to adopt a unilateral policy. Actually, it wasn't just the Bush administration. Clinton started with his dual containment policy against Iran and Iraq. Then basically George W. Bush started with the United States was going to intervene in the global war on terror, intervene against Iraq virtually unilaterally. What Obama wanted to do was to restore offshore balancing in order to make sure that our allies would pick up the heavy lifting in the region. And the Saudis turned to Obama and said, "What do you think? We're crazy? We're not going to do that. This is your job." And the Israelis did the same. So fundamentally, Obama lost as far as I was concerned. Nobody wanted to step up to the plate anymore. Their interests were not the same as American interests, particularly if they saw the Americans leaving the region. In addition to that, Obama could not have foreseen things like the uprisings of 2010, 2011 that took place throughout the Arab world, and could not have seen that the results of those uprisings were going to lead to confusion in the region, was going to lead to upheaval in the region, was going to lead to a spread of proxy wars and a spread of autocratic or further repression in the region as well. So he couldn't see any of that stuff. So there was that aspect to it. On the other hand, there was this little bit of wishful thinking on the part of the Obama administration that, the allies in the region would fall in line, and the allies in the region had their own agendas. So when Trump comes to the region, comes to the Middle East, he fundamentally says, "Okay, look, what do you guys want?" His first trip was to Saudi Arabia and to Israel during his first administration. And fundamentally, he became a pawn in the hands of Saudi Arabia and Israel. He adopted their problems as our problems. So, for example, he withdrew from the nuclear agreement with Iran. There was no reason to do that except for the fact that, the Saudis and the Israelis convinced him that this was necessary for him to do. And so this was all the way down the line. He adopted the Saudi and the Israeli viewpoint on the Middle East with the idea that, fundamentally these guys knew what they were talking about, and what we want to do is to reverse what the Obama administration had done before us. And so the real damage was done actually in the Trump administration. The Obama administration was sort of like set off the part of the problem in terms of its attempt to restore what was called offshore balancing.
It sounds like what you're saying is that the Obama era policy was almost telling Saudi Arabia, you're going to have to like share this neighborhood with Iran, and the Saudis are like, no way.
That was exactly his words. You're going to have to learn to share the neighborhood. Those are exactly his words. And fundamentally, you're right. The Saudis said, no, no way in hell we're going to do this. What we have to do is Iran represents an existential threat to us. And so, therefore, what we are going to do is not to accept Iran. Particularly, we're not going to allow any sort of like steps towards a nuclear weapon on the part of Iran. What we have to do is confront Iran at every juncture we possibly can. And so the Iranians, or excuse me, the Saudis tended to exaggerate the threat from Iran. So they saw an Iranian boogeyman where they were looking. They saw an Iranian boogeyman in Yemen, for example. They saw an Iranian boogeyman in Bahrain. And states in the region understood this, and they learned that all they had to do was to scream Iran, and they would get help from Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. And they certainly did so.
Now, where does that leave Saudi Arabia now? And I guess I wanted to ask you, I'll see some people try to argue that the Saudi-Iran relationship has changed because of the rapprochement in 2023. Do you think some people play into that too much? Do you think they make too much of it? Or do you think there has been a change in Saudi-Iranian relations?
There's been a change, but it mainly has to do with the loss of allies of Iran and the loss of its capabilities in terms of ballistic missiles and anti-missile defense and that sort of stuff as well that's taken place within the last 2 years. I think what's really important is to understand that what the Saudis and the Iranians were up to before has not changed at all. Saudi Arabia is still a status quo power. Iran is still a revolutionary power. It doesn't like the way the status quo is. And that the word rapprochement, which has been used by media a lot in terms of Saudi Arabia, actually beginning to talk to Iran, setting up its embassy in Iran once again, an exchange of ambassadors took place, that this was rapprochement. It wasn't rapprochement. There's another Cold War term that's better than that, which is détente, which is that the competition will continue, but the temperature will be cooled a bit. In other words, that the threat of all-out war will be cooled, and that the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran will be done within a certain set of parameters that won't boil over. The competition is still there. The interest is still very different. And given the point at which either side could be at an advantage, then the détente will be over.
I'm glad you mentioned the way the media refers to these things because there was an interview you gave, I think, in 2018, where you talked about how there's appalling circumstances when we talk about the Middle East. And you said you're not just referring to the killing fields of Syria or Yemen, but to the onslaught on clarity, accuracy, and directness currently taking place in the United States. Where do you think discourse about the Middle East and the region has gone wrong in the United States, and what has it wrought?
I think that there are several things that, several real problems that are taking place. We've dropped the ball in terms of what unfortunately George W. Bush called the freedom agenda. In other words, we don't care anymore about, the levels of repression in places like Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or Egypt or any of the places like that. What we care about now is fundamentally what these places can do for us on a more, let's say, just cost benefit analysis basis. So there's that aspect to it. Look at American attitudes towards Saudi Arabia, for example, and Mohammed bin Salman. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, okay, look, what Salman is doing is he's opening up, for example, trade agreements with the United States, a golf course here, a golf course there, buying weapons from the United States. He's allowed women to drive. He's, taken the hand of the religious police and sort of like pushed it back. On the other hand, the level of repression in Saudi Arabia has not changed at all. And Saudi Arabia is still as repressive, if not more, than it has been over the last, half century or so. So there's that aspect of it. Saudi Arabia has gotten more energetic in terms of the region and what is its intervention in the region. So the United States has pretty much turned a blind eye to this. It's turned a blind eye to what the UAE has been doing, and particularly in the Red Sea area and in the Gulf and in the Horn of Africa. It's turned a blind eye to the level of repression in places like Egypt and Bahrain. So the United States is fundamentally turned away from what was going on, what American policy had been since fundamentally the 1980s or so. So there's that aspect to it. Then there's the intense focus on Israel-Palestine, which is walking away from the Oslo Agreement, the Oslo Accord, and walking away from the idea of a future Palestinian state. That what the United States has been doing has been very ambiguous in terms of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, Israeli policy towards Gaza. And what the United States has attempted to do has been to walk away from a two-state solution and to experiment with other possible solutions to the Israel-Palestine conflict. One of which was floated by Trump, for example, the idea of let's move all the Palestinians out of Gaza and rebuild it and then figure out where to put them. And this is still not on the table in the United States, but it's certainly on the table in Israel. One of the rumors that has been started is whether or not the Israeli Somaliland mutual recognitions that took place about a month ago, whether or not that mutual recognition was to enable Somaliland to be susceptible to Israeli pressure to take Palestinians in. So there is that aspect to what Israeli policy is, which is they still have not forsworn removing Palestinians from Gaza. They still have not forsworn the idea of dividing up the West Bank or annexing the West Bank by dividing it up into cantons that are not particularly, not contiguous to each other, et cetera, et cetera.
In terms of issues like energy and economics, how is that going to play in the future of the region?
It's very ambiguous at the present time. I mean, obviously, there was this movement away from oil towards sustainable energy, renewable energy. That has been, I mean, we basically attacked Venezuela in order to obtain oil, which, according to the reports of the last 2 days, it's not going to be attainable and it's not very profitable for the United States anyway. So the United States is trying to move away from renewable sources. This doesn't mean the rest of the world is as well, but fundamentally, it does mean that one of the largest powers in the world has sort of like turned its back on global warming and climate change.
Since you mentioned Venezuela, does the way that was carried out potentially have any impact on how things could turn out in the Middle East? What I mean by that is it seems like international law was completely bypassed um, with this military operation. Could that have an effect on how players in the Middle East act?
Absolutely. We start off with the George W. Bush administration, the idea of neoconservatives, the neocons, who fundamentally were different from their more liberal antagonists in the United States. The more liberal antagonists would say, fundamentally, what we want to do is assert American power, but we want to do it according to international law. We want to do it according to treaties. We want to work with the United Nations. We want to work with our allies, and so on and so forth. What the neocons said was, screw it, we don't care. And fundamentally, we're just going to throw our weight around, which is exactly what Donald Trump is doing at the present time. The neocons actually had a freedom agenda, which, whether they were serious about it or not, is something that's worth arguing about. But Trump doesn't even have the fig leaf of that at the present time. I mean, America first, according to Trump, is the idea that, fundamentally we can throw our weight around without anything having to do with international law. Now, the United States was, violated international law off and on during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, but never with the same impunity as it's doing now. For example, in terms of Libya, what the United States attempted to do was to get a United Nations resolution that would support NATO intervention in Libya. The same thing with, every time the United States attempted to intervene in, for example, in Kuwait, for example, against the Iraqis, in terms of the dual containment policy that the United States was trying to enforce and that sort of thing. So we obeyed international law in that sense, at least in terms of our tipping our hat to international law. The Trump administration doesn't care about the niceties of that, and so neither does the various states in the Middle East. It's supposedly you're not supposed to intervene in the internal affairs of, another state. Well, the states in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are doing that with impunity. And of course, Iran has done that as well. So this is something that the United States has sort of like led the way on. Same thing with Israel. I mean, Israel's various assassinations that have taken place in various national capitals, be it in Doha, Qatar, be it in Damascus, Syria, be it in Tehran, Iran. It's bombing of the Iranian nuclear facility. It's bombing of various other places as well. It's occupation of Syrian territory. It's occupation of Lebanese territory. All these things are violations of international law. It's expansion of the settlements on the West Bank. It's the way it's used force in Gaza. Again, violations of international law. Do the Israelis care? Not a whit.
I wanted to ask, since you mentioned Netanyahu said recently, as you mentioned earlier, that he wants to taper um, U.S. aid off from Israel, like he wants to uh, not have to rely on the U.S. I've seen some people say, well, what does he mean by that? How would Israel be able to make a go of things without U.S. support? What do you make of these statements he's been making? Because I've actually seen it from other figures on the Israeli right wing saying this as well. What is the reason for this sort of rhetoric, I guess?
Well, if you pay the piper, he calls a tune. And that's exactly what Netanyahu doesn't want from the United States. Netanyahu started out by talking about Sparta and saying that Israel will become like Sparta, autarkic, dependent only on itself, having forgotten, of course, that Sparta eventually lost and was defeated by a Theban confederacy. But Netanyahu's vision is the idea that Israel can go it alone, which means that Israel does not need the backing of anybody. It's already been condemned widely for the Gaza war, which much of the world views rightly as a genocidal war. Its annexationist policies towards the West Bank are very, very unpopular and spurred the Western European alliance to actually begin recognition of Palestine as a state, and with all that entails as well. And he's afraid that the United States, that the balance is tipping against him in the United States in terms of a generational balance that's taking place. that younger people in the United States, not only Democrats and independents, but Republicans as well, are viewing Israel less favorably in terms of allowing Israel the benefit of the doubt, which the United States has done in the past. So walking away from the United States is sort of like it's already a fait accompli, walking away from the rest of the world. Much of the rest of the world is hostile towards what Israeli ambitions are. And Netanyahu doesn't want the Israel itself to become or to maintain its dependency on outside forces, on outside sources of armaments. So the Israeli armaments industry is a very strong industry. It's something that the United States has tried to undercut, for example, by making it so that Israel has to spend the money that the United States gives to Israel. It has to spend it in the United States. So it's become a jobs program for the United States. It hasn't become an armaments program for Israel. So what the Israelis want to do is not want to do what the Israelis have decided that they've been forced to do, is to walk away from the United States to build up their own defense industry. And at the present time, the Israelis are stronger than the sum total of the forces arrayed against it. And that's been demonstrated in the last several years or so. So the Israelis are not making much of a sacrifice from walking away from the United States. And frankly, the United States owes itself the right to walk away from its obligations to Israel or the commitments that it made to Israel, simply because those commitments have been over, in terms of what the Israelis have done with American weapons, have been horrendous, particularly in the last 2 years.
Do you see any chance of will the relationships between Israel and other states in the region also change along with its relationship with the US? Like, is there any possibility of its relationship with Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states or even Turkey? Will those things alter in the next decade as well, potentially?
Well, Israel is making a choice, and that choice is what's more important for Israel is some sort of settlement in terms of the Palestinian question on Israeli terms, or some sort of settlement with other Arab states. And this is where Joe Biden got it all wrong. Joe Biden sort of like wanted to make this grand deal where there would be a ceasefire in Gaza, there would be Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the Saudis would recognize Israel, Israel would have relations with Saudi Arabia, there would be steps towards a Palestinian state, and all that would work out real well. Well, for the Israelis, it's not so simple. And for the Israelis, what they would prefer is a settlement on their own terms with the Palestinians, as opposed to making peace with the Saudis, having some sort of rapprochement with the Saudi Arabians. Now, the thing about the Saudis is that the Saudis are paying lip service to the Palestinian cause. But the Saudi population and the Arab population outside of Saudi Arabia is very strongly supportive of the Palestinian cause. So the Saudis really can't go against that per se. So if there was some sort of fig leaf that the Israelis were willing to give the Saudis would probably go for it. But at the present time, the Israelis can't afford to give Saudi Arabia a fig leaf because the Netanyahu administration has got to survive if Netanyahu is going to stay out of jail. And so, therefore, what he's very dependent upon, what Netanyahu is very dependent upon, is support from the extreme right wing, which is annexationist. And so, therefore, the last thing that Netanyahu wants to do is to support some sort of grand deal in which there would be some sort of settlement with the Palestinians. What they want to do is to keep this ambiguous. What Netanyahu wants to do is to keep this ambiguous for as long as possible in order to maintain his freedom from the corruption charges that he's being charged with at the present time.
So, in other words, it sounds like Netanyahu is just looking out for himself, looking out for number one, and then you have this other force, which is the Israeli sort of far right. I would say epitomized by people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich.
Yes, I mean that's absolutely the case. Netanyahu is fundamentally without ideology. He is, of course, Likud, which means that beneath it all, he believes in a greater Israel. Beneath it all, he would love to see Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. That's fundamentally what his ideological underpinnings are. But we have to understand that, there are examples of Likud ministers, for example, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was perfectly prepared to take 80% of the loaf and leave 20% behind, to build the wall, for example, that allowed for Palestinians to do something outside of the wall, whether it was building a state or having chaos or whatever. He didn't really care. But he was prepared to withdraw from parts of the West Bank and from the Gaza Strip, from the entirety of the Gaza Strip, in order to be able to have a fortress Israel that would be contained and defensible, let's put it that way. And so, what he did was, was that in particular. Now, he was a Likud member. He was somebody who was committed to the idea of a greater Israel, but he was also somebody who understood full well that, 80% of the loaf is better than no percent of the loaf.
You mentioned earlier Netanyahu sort of forgetting one of the lessons of Sparta. On this show, I've often argued that the worst thing nations can do is give in to hubris or forget the lessons of history. Um, how do you, not to get philosophical, but how do you think hubristic leadership and the forgetting of history play into the shaping of the Middle East, both in recent memory and going forward?
Well, there's so much that you could look at in the terms of the most recent past. And by the way, you are talking, of course, to a historian, so I'm very much on your side on this one. But you look what's going on, and we could actually have predicted much of what was going on just by looking at the past. For example, the every time that there is a attempt to keep the Palestine issue off the front burner, the Palestinians perform some sort of operation that puts it back on the international agenda. Palestinian factions are committed to making sure that there's no compromises that are being made. The Palestinian factions want to make sure that they can trump their enemies within the Palestinian national movement. All three of these things took place in October when Hamas decided to strike against Israel. The whole idea was we were all talking about a Saudi-Israeli deal before October 7th. Starting on October 7th, we're all talking about Gaza and Palestinians and Israel at the present time. So that was foreseeable. The other thing that was foreseeable is, just the way this thing was going to turn out in terms of the Israelis attempting to, for example, support collaborators in Gaza. They did the exact same thing in Lebanon with the exact same results. The collaborators were eliminated, and therefore, and Israel was left without anybody that they could talk to. The whole Lebanese adventure in 1982 was sparked by the idea of getting rid of getting rid of those who opposed the collaborators and getting rid of the PLO in Lebanon. And the PLO did not disappear in the same way that Hamas is not going to disappear. And Israel got stuck in a quagmire, very, very similar to the same quagmire that it got stuck in this time as well. So Israel didn't learn from its history from 1982. It didn't learn from its history at other times as well. The United States, for example, did not learn that Israel is not going to be able to deliver a knockout blow in the same way that the United States has had difficulty delivering its knockout blow against counterinsurgency movements. So therefore, we do have a lot of history that we can look back on and say, oh, basically we're repeating the exact same mistake over and over and over again. Remember George W. Bush's landing on the aircraft carrier and, displaying the sign that said, victory. There was no victory. Mission was not accomplished at that time. That the United States got stuck in a quagmire in Iraq, and that this is a very, very similar situation to what the Israelis are stuck in at the present time.
Since we were talking about issues we could have predicted, I know a lot of people didn't predict or have on their bingo cards since the last time we spoke the fall of Assad and now the rise of Ahmed Al-Sharaa. What do you make of this development in Syria and what has happened since Al-Sharaa has gotten into power?
Well, there's two ways of looking at it. One of which is globally at the present time, in the sense that Al-Sharaa was able to take power at a point at which Russia was not able to support the Assad regime anymore. To the extent it had been before. Russia, of course, got bogged down in Ukraine, and so the insurgents in Syria were able to take advantage of that and were able to deliver a knockout blow because Moscow had its eye elsewhere. It wasn't only Moscow, by the way, of course, it was Hezbollah as well, and it was Iran as well. So those things took place as a result of international and regional developments. On the other hand, what's going to happen in Syria is still an open book. We just don't know. I am not extremely optimistic about the future of Syria. The Syrian government at the present time wants to centralize control. There are groupings within Syria that don't want centralized control. We've seen this with the Druze, for example, that are being supported by the Israelis. We've seen this with the Alawites who are fighting on the coastline. We see that with the Kurds who were fighting not only in the territory that was their autonomous state, Rojava, but also fighting in Aleppo against the regime. So what we see is all these centrifugal forces that are fighting against the central government of Syria. There's also the forces that were unleashed during the civil war as well, which was Syria was a good representative of what is called warlordism, where you have these local warlords that are able to take control of a certain amount of territory and take control of a certain resource to finance the military in order to maintain control of that territory. And that resource could be, for example, taxation of the population, could be selling of drugs, which took place in Syria. It could be petroleum. It could be control over a border area. All these things will allow these various warlords to maintain the control over areas in Syria. Now, these warlords are still there. And so far, they have not been eliminated. So far, the power is sort of not anymore consolidated by the central government. So we have these various groupings like the Kurds, like the Druze, like the Alawites on the coast, along with various local warlords who are fighting to maintain some sort of control within Syria. So the future of Syria is not, sort of like consolidation at the present time. We don't know what the future of Syria is going to be. We don't know whether or not, for example, even the proxy war has ended within Syria. The Turks have a very different idea of what they want to see in Syria than the Gulf states do, for example. The Turks are not particularly put off by the idea of having an Islamist government in Syria, as opposed to the Gulf, which is. So we see very, very competing forces outside of Syria as well as competing forces within Syria.
This actually gets into an area I wanted to delve into with you, and that's you mentioned how there's all these different groupings, ethnicities, religious affiliations in the Middle East. I think a lot of people will just talk about, oh, there's Sunni and Shia, but it goes much deeper than that. What role does identity and nationalism play in the Middle East, and how much more do we need to understand it? Because I feel like at times it's only understood superficially by American, maybe pundits and reporters.
Yeah, I mean, this is particularly the case in terms of American foreign policy and the way we look at things. For example, Joe Biden once said that, the craziness of the borders in the Middle East, that we should have allowed people to be among their own and that sort of stuff. You have to understand that sectarianism is a product of history. It's not a creator of history. In other words, there was no reason why the Syrian civil war had to be sectarianized, except for the fact that the government of Syria sectarianized it. In other words, it started out with the population of Syria wanting to overthrow a dictatorial regime. And then what happened was the regime itself, which which was based in the Alawite community, a minority community, maybe 14% of the population, sectarianized the dispute. They had, for example, they launched attacks against Sunnis at prayer, for example. They released jihadists from prison. They made it so it was no longer a battle between those who wanted the overthrow of the regime versus those who supported the regime, into a battle between Sunnis and Alawites in Syria and other minorities that supported the Alawites because they felt that they were threatened if the Sunnis took control. Again, this is the same thing that occurs multiple places within the region. The Syrian civil war spilled over into other places as well. There was the rise of ISIS, which was a Sunni nationalist movement that wanted to carve out a state that killed non-Sunnis, that radicalized non-Sunnis as well as Sunnis and other non-Sunnis, so that they had the sense of being something of having a identity that was very, very different from the Sunni identity. Before the American invasion of Iraq, for example, 30% of the marriages in Iraq were between Sunnis and Shiis. You know, they were both Muslims, so what do they care? So I mean, and as a matter of fact, this was encouraged by the Iraqi government, as it's encouraged now by the Iraqi government, in order to foster an Iraqi identity. So there's rewards for when you do an intersectarian marriage. During the Iraqi Civil War, which broke out after the American invasion, Sunnis and Shiis, were at loggerheads, simply because for the first time it was Shiis now that were being empowered by the Americans, as opposed to the Sunnis who had been in power. And so it was very easy for forces within Iraq to sectarianize the conflict within Iraq, making it Sunni versus Shia in the same way. This is something that's gone on in the United States in terms of race, for example. In terms of the Middle East, it's done in terms of sectarianization. And there's no inherent reason why the sectarian relations or race relations within the United States have to become the pivot point for identity, within the two countries. It's something that can be used as something that can be made by political entrepreneurs. And those entrepreneurs can be political parties, they can be governments, they can be individuals that we seek to exploit whatever leverage they can exploit by calling into question identities that, fundamentally are not necessarily identities that people would grasp at to begin with.
Can you speak a little bit more to the way in which that affects sort of U.S. perceptions? The sort of the way that sectarianism is instrumentalized, because I feel like we have all these different competing interest groups. Even with right now Iran, you have people that are pro Pahlavi and pro the old monarchy, and then you have the MEK sort of type supporters that don't like the Islamic Republic or Pahlavi. So it feels like you have different interest groups sort of influencing perceptions in the U.S. and trying to paint, maybe, for instance, with Syria, I will hear, well, the Alawites are bad. Actually, the Alawites are good. And I think I think sometimes people want to paint a black and white picture about these different groupings.
You're absolutely right. And, for example, in Iran, for example, the United States has been supporting the Mujahideen, which is a cult, actually, against the government, simply because the Mujahideen has been able to play its cards right, have been able to actually corrupt and bribe the necessary officials like, Rudy Giuliani and a whole group of them to support them. Against the Islamic Republic. Now, if you look at the Islamic Republic and you say, okay, look, this is an Islamic Republic after all, they're going to be hostile. Well, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, the differences between the Islamic Republic and what the Pahlavis did is not that great, except for the fact that one was a republic, one was a monarchy. One uses Islamic imagery, the other doesn't. But they're both, extraordinarily centralizing forces within their particular governments. They're both sort of like trying to consolidate as much power as they possibly can. And the discourses that they use are just different. So there's really nothing that separates the Islamic Republic from Iran from the Pahlavi administration, except for the fact that the Islamic Republic itself sees itself as embattled and sees itself as being a disruptor, sees itself as being a vanguard of a revolutionary movement that is at loggerheads with the status quo powers in the region. So that's the big difference between the two. Sunni, Shia, I mean, after all, the Iranians backed Hamas, for example, which is a Sunni group. Hamas was on the side of Syria, the Syrian government for a while until the Syrian government began to attack Palestinians within Syria. So it's not a Sunni Shia thing whatsoever. That's overly simplifying it. And this is the way Americans like to look at this stuff. It's called Orientalism. The idea that these people are primitives, that they can't get out of their religious background, that when you scratch a Middle Easterner, you're going to find a Muslim, you're going to find a Shia, you're going to find a Sunni, you're going to find an Alawite, and that they don't have the same forms of identity that, for example, people in the West do. Well, that's not true. That's not the case at all. For example, as I said, in Iraq, Sunni Shia marriages are commonplace. Intersectarian marriages in Lebanon are not the case, for example. And so Sunnis and Shiis cannot get married in Lebanon unless one converts to the other. So it's the Iraqi attitude is that they're both Muslims, who cares? When it comes to marriage, the Lebanese attitude is, well, you have Sunnis, you have Shiis, they both have representation within the government. They each have their own form of representation within the government, and so therefore they have to be considered two separate groupings.
I also hope this is a too philosophical a question, but do you think sometimes the human cost gets overlooked when talking about this region of the world? Because I feel like we view things in terms of, oh, these different sects, but there's a lot of people just caught in the middle of these forces that are outside of their control. And I think that gets lost in the way we narrativize things here in the US.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, your question brings back to something that Mike Pence said when he was vice president, which is that the United States has been a force for good in the Middle East for 200 years. Well, if you ask the Americans, we've been a force for stability within the Middle East for 200 years. Yeah, that's true. Or actually not within 200 years, since the Second World War. We've been a force for stability. But look at the price of that that's been paid by Middle Easterners. The price being that the United States is the largest arms supplier in the world in terms of the Middle East. And most of those arms have been used in order to repress populations. Those arms have been used against Kurds, for example. Those arms have been used against other people of other nations, against Palestinians. And so the United States has a lot to answer for in those terms as well. The United States supports some of the most repressive governments in the world in the Middle East. I mean, we're good buddies now with the Saudis and with the Emiratis. But the Saudis just had a record-setting year in terms of executions, public executions of Saudi citizens, and has been repressive towards more than half of its population, towards the female population of Saudi Arabia. So the United States has a lot to answer for in the region. We prefer to have stability than to have a situation in which we might not be in control, in which, for example, there is the ability of the populations to speak out for themselves. The best example of that is what happened in 1953 in Iran, when the United States overthrew a government in Iran that was elected, a popular government in Iran, because the United States thought that that government might be pro-Soviet. And that government had nationalized the oil that at that time was controlled by the British. So the United States fundamentally has its own problems in the region, its own sins in the region.
What I wanted to go back to, and I should have said it earlier, was I guess when people talk about these different sects, or they talk about Alawites versus this group, or this group versus that, I think sometimes we look at things in terms of the good guys versus the bad guys, the cowboys versus the Indians, and it's not. I don't think you can do that with the Middle East. I think there's a lot of tragedy and blood on different cans. And do you think there's a way that people can understand the nuances, I guess is what I'm getting at?
Well, I think that what we have to do is get beyond this idea the Middle East is exceptional in some way. The Middle East is not particularly exceptional. I mean, the same rules that apply to Europe, for example, apply to the Middle East. Hell, I mean, the Middle East state system is more stable than the European state system. The European state system has more monarchs than the Middle East state system does. So overall, what we have to begin to do is to get rid of our prejudices. We don't look at terms of Catholic versus Protestant within Europe, for example. Why do we look in terms of Shia versus Sunni within the Middle East? And people, in the region understand that. And so they were able to manipulate the United States in terms of American foreign policy by saying, okay, look, we are a bulwark of stability here. We are a grouping that is very much against, for example, this Shia crescent that wants to overthrow the American power. No, no, no. It's the Sunnis that are the radicals, the jihadis that want to overthrow American policy in the Middle East. Well, it's exploited by the people within the region, by governments within the region, by political entrepreneurs within the region, in order to sort of like suck in the United States into a situation in which it's a total misreading of what's going on within the region.
I just had two more questions. One of my listeners wanted me to ask you about the role of neoliberalism in the economic order that came out of the 1970s globally, and the role that has had on the Middle East, and if that's changing now.
Oh, that's a very good question. That's fundamentally globally, that's the question. That's a $64,000 question. I mean, in the Middle East, for example, neoliberalism has not been good to the populations in the Middle East. States made a bargain with their populations during the period of decolonization, which was benefits for compliance. In other words, you sit down, you shut up, and we'll take care of you. Well, what happens when the states decide they're not going to take care of you? And this is what's happened in the Middle East over and over and over again. Now, it hasn't taken place within the oil monarchies. So when you had this whiff of uprisings taking place in 2010, 2011, the monarchies bought off as much of the population as they possibly could. They gave benefits for the compliance of the population. But take a look at Egypt, for example, which has attempted to do things like withdraw from subsidies that it was giving to various groupings within society. Subsidies for things like bread and fuel that the poor desperately need in Egypt. That, crony capitalism is rampant in places like Egypt. That comes from privatization, that the income disparities are incredible in the Middle East as well. This has triggered a lot of conflict within the region. And you have to remember that in addition to the demands for democracy and human freedom, there was a demand for social and economic justice in 2010, 2011, that were part of the primary reasons for the rebellions taking place. In those places where the rebellions really had traction, was those places in which there was a strong union movement, trade union movement. For example, in Tunisia, in which the Trade Union Confederation, the UGTT, supported the rebellion against the administration. The labor movement in Egypt supported the rebellion against Hosni Mubarak. The union movement, for example, in Yemen, believe it or not, was very much in support of the rebellion against the Yemeni state. So you have to understand that neoliberalism was very much part and parcel of these rebellions that took place. And we tend to forget that this is something that is very, very important to the population there. We tend to forget it to such an extent that when Barack Obama, at the end of the first phase of the Egyptian uprising, when he said, we have to help Tunisia, we have to help Egypt, so what are we going to do? We're going to help them with get loans from the IMF, which means that we have to put conditionalities on those loans as well. In other words, more neoliberalism and not less neoliberalism, which is the exact thing that Tunisians and Egyptians were fighting against.
Before closing out, it sounds like one of the things you're saying is that in a lot of ways, the Middle East, part of the problem is that we view it as very separate from us or very different, when, people are people all the way around, whether they're from the Middle East or the United States.
Yeah, no, it's very true. I mean, you look at the crisis of 2008, the financial crisis of 2008. Practically every government in Europe fell at that time. During the same period, what you had was the Americans. They voted in a Democratic president and then a Republican Congress. Throughout the rest of the globe, there was, the Occupy movements that began to spring up, Occupy Wall Street, the movements in Spain, for example, the movements in Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, et cetera, et cetera. All these things were taking place within, globally. That, the rebellion against neoliberalism has taken a whole variety of forms, some of which have been the Occupy movement, some of which have been the rebellions in the Middle East, some of which have been populist movements in the West and other places as well. I mean, for example, the spread of populism in Brazil and various other places, Poland and what have you, that's taken place. The spread of populism. You have Donald Trump in the United States. You have Brexit in Britain. All these things might be traced back to a common set of problems that the world is confronting, which is problems that are associated, again, with neoliberalism and problems associated with the way in which populations are rebelling against the spread of neoliberal economic policies, which really didn't begin until the 1970s. Hell, even human rights and the discourse of human rights is a rebellion against neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, the whole idea of neoliberalism is the idea of individual rights as opposed to collective rights that had been very popular in the global South before the spread of neoliberalism. Now it's individual human rights, which most regimes give their just sort of like mouthing pay lip service to.
I know you have to get going, but I did want to ask one more question. I hope it's not too personal, but I've always sensed that you, as a historian, view yourself as having certain duties and responsibilities as a historian. And you've given so much of your life to being an accurate and thoughtful and clarifying observer of the modern Middle East. Can you speak to what has driven you in regards to your work and what you feel that your greater duty and responsibility is as a historian?
Well, first of all, I very much appreciate what you're saying. I mean, you're absolutely right, is that I spend a lot of my time and a lot of my work that I've written has been, to reach a more general audience. Look, I mean, there's those of us who've been blessed with a certain amount of education and knowledge of the region. I've lived there. I've done a lot of research there. I've written about it quite a bit. And so, fundamentally, I see the United States blundering, in terms of its policies, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well. But my expertise lies within the Middle East. And so that's what I'm going to address. There's, for those of us who have lived there, have been there, who have friends there, who have, very, very strong relationships to people within the Middle East, it's really heartbreaking to see just what's going on, and not only within the region, but our responsibility for a lot of what's going on. There were about, let's say, about 170,000 people have been casualties in the Arab-Israeli conflicts that have taken place since 1948 to the 2023. In 2023, we have about the same number of casualties that had taken place in all the years before this. About 70,000 worth of fatalities in Gaza, and the rest have been in terms of injuries in Gaza. So what we're seeing right now is a expansion of the horrific casualties that have been encountered in the previous, since 1945 or so. And so, therefore, what we have to begin to do is I have to begin to step back and say, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to change this? And whereas some people are going to be able to focus on other areas of the world, Latin Americanists, I hope, are stepping up to the plate right now. People who have their expertise in Russia, for example, have already stepped up to the plate. That we owe a certain amount of responsibility to the American population to expand our knowledge of exactly what's going on globally.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.